Mitakeapi. So some people asked me for some beading lessons, and I'm actually going to start at the end of a project today because I've got a piece of finished beadwork. So I'm going to show you how to back it and edge it to complete it. So what you're going to need is your completed beadwork. I've got some cardboard that I back it with. These came from the inside of a fabric pack. I usually use cardboard from either pop boxes or cereal boxes. You don't want to use anything much thicker than that because it will mess with the quality of your beadwork. I've also got some leather. This is brain tan smoked deer hide. It's the best leather you can find. Some people don't like to spend the money on this type of leather. And if you're okay with beating up your hands with cheap leather, then go for it. Otherwise, I'd recommend getting yourself some of this. Pencil, scissors, E6000 glue, and I've got my thread here too. So the first thing I'm going to do is cut out my beadwork. And you want to get as close to the beads as possible without actually snipping the thread. So when you're actually doing your beadwork, you want to make sure that your stitches are tight and close to the beadwork. You don't want any stitches that are way out here. Otherwise you're going to have trouble cutting the material close to the beads. If you snip a thread, you're going to be fixing it, and that's not the funnest thing to do. Okay, it's all cut out. So the next thing I'm going to do is take my cardboard and just draw around. Actually, I'm going to go on the edge here so I don't waste any. And what this cardboard is going to do is stiffen your beadwork so it'll lay nice and flat. Use some cheaper scissors for this. So I drew the outline of the beadwork. I'm not going to cut right on the line. I'm actually going to cut on the inside of the line because you don't want your cardboard running all the way up to the edge of your beadwork. Otherwise you're going to have a hard time sewing through the edges to connect it to the back piece of leather. Okay, so I cut that out. Next I'm going to do the leather. Some people will use pencils. Sometimes I use like an orange pen to do the outline of my beadwork. Let me see if I can find one. Alright, don't know what happened to my orange pen, so I'm going to use a red one. If you use black, then it just shows up really clearly, and if you don't get that cut off, then it can show up in your beadwork, and you don't want that. So there's two sides to the leather. You can use whichever side that you want to show. I always use this side on the outside and this side on the inside. You want to be very thoughtful in how you cut this out. I usually run things all the way up to the edges, and I'll look at the whole piece of leather to see if there's a good place to start cutting from. You also want to be aware of any inconsistencies in the leather. If you've got like a hard piece or one that doesn't look appealing, you might want to find another spot. But definitely don't ever do this where you put it in the middle of the leather and then just cut it out, because you're going to end up wasting a lot. And this type of leather, any type of leather you don't want to waste, but this stuff you most certainly do not waste. So I'm just going to start from this corner, I think. So you're looking for a spot to start where you'll waste the least amount of leather. So I'm just gonna, again, draw the outline of my beadwork. Okay. The reason I prefer orange and red pens to pencil is sometimes if your pencil isn't like freshly sharpened, it'll be difficult to see on the leather sometimes, and it can be hard to draw on it. So I'm going to go ahead and cut my leather out now. And let's see if you can see this. I'm actually using that all the way to the edge, where the man that softened this hide, he actually sewed it together to smoke it, and you can see those stitches right here. I'm still using that part. There's nothing wrong with it, and it'll probably make it easier to sew together. Okay, so there's my cutout piece. I know some people look for their leather to be just completely perfect in color and consistency and all of that. I myself think that some imperfections actually add to the character of what I'm doing and make them look better. So you can see that there's some white on the edge of that. I think it just adds to it. All right, so next what I'm gonna do, I've got my 3 pieces here. I'm gonna take my E6000 glue. This is the only type of glue that I use when I'm beading and making things. I'm gonna go ahead and put it on my beadwork here. This is obviously an old tube, so it's a little bit difficult to get out. So I'm going to spread this out a little bit. If it were coming out a little bit easier, I wouldn't have to do this necessarily. The thing about E6000 glue that you need to remember is that this is very strong glue. So once you glue something together and it sets, it's not coming apart. So if you realize you made a mistake or you don't want it to be together for some reason, you better take it apart before it dries. And you can get this glue pretty much anywhere. And you want to make sure you put enough on that will give it good coverage, but don't slather your beadwork in glue. If you get too much on there, it's going to start seeping out the edges, and then you're going to have trouble. And just like if your cardboard were running up to the edges of the beadwork, if your glue runs up to the edge of the beadwork, you're going to have trouble sewing through it. Okay, so I'm just pressing the cardboard on like that. And I know some people let this dry completely before they move on to the next step. I'm a little too impatient for that, and I always just go ahead and do the next step. So that's what I'm going to do now. Okay, so that should be more than enough. Now I'm just going to press the leather onto my beadwork. Okay, so now that I've got the leather, the whole back on there, you can see some of the leather is poking out the edges there. So I'm gonna trim it just to make sure that everything's even. If you want to buy yourself a gift, I recommend Singer scissors. These are some of the best scissors I've got. I got mine at Joann Fabrics on Black Friday, I think. They cut through leather really well. Okay, so that's all together. I'm gonna let it just sit for just a few minutes. Okay, so we are ready to edge our beadwork. I've got some brass beads out that I'm going to use to do the edging. I'm going to show you two different ways to edge it. Before we get started, I've got my thread here. This is a size, oh, wrong one. This is a size 00. I actually use this to tack beadwork down, and if I'm edging with size 13 Charlotte cuts, this is actually what I'll use because it is thin enough to go through a size 13 bead twice. This is my size D thread. These both are Nemo thread, so if you want to finish the edges by burning them, they'll melt a little bit. I use size D, which is the biggest, just because it's nice and thick and strong. I also use size B on occasion too. So I'm gonna cut my thread. I usually use my arm length to measure how much I'm gonna cut. If I'm doing a large project, I'll use both arms length. Don't do more than that because it'll be hard to manage. I'll thread my needle. I'm currently watching Downton Abbey, and they just got hit with the Spanish flu. And Lavinia just died. I actually go through a bunch of different TV shows when I sit and bead. I'll go through entire shows so I don't have to change out the DVD. Alright, so I put 2 knots in the end of my thread there. I'm actually going to run some thread strengthener. I've actually got 2 kinds here. I've got beeswax and then I've got Thread Heaven. I actually prefer the Thread Heaven. I'll use the beeswax if I don't have anything else. So just run my thread through it a few times. This just strengthens the thread. So if you're doing a project, certainly of this size, the more you go through the material, the thread will start to fray, and this kind of conditioner just keeps it from fraying as easy. And if your thread does fray, then you can just run it through this kind of stuff again, and that'll make it better. Also, when thread starts to fray, it knots up a lot easier, and you definitely don't want knots in your thread. Okay, so I'm going to begin. I usually just start by going between the leather and the thread, and I'll put my needle up through that white material. Right there, it's not going through any beads. And then just make sure you pull all the way. So like I said, there are two ways that I'm going to show you. The first one is a whip stitch. I do whip stitch on a lot of stuff to finish the edges. And you just go through the back edge and back through the front material. And pull. And you want to keep your stitches fairly close together. And you just do that whip stitch all the way around if that's how you want to finish it. So the next way I'm going to show you, which is how I'm actually going to finish this, is actually kind of a basic applique stitch. I'm going to put 3 of these beads on. Put them all the way down. Make sure they're all lined up like that. And then I'm going to put my thread down where the last bead ends. And it's going to go through both the white material and the leather. Alright. So now I'm going to go through the back here. And between the first and second beads. And then I'm going to go through the second and the third bead. And pull tight. Always make sure you're pulling tight. So I'm going to put on 3 more beads. And again, put them all the way to the end. Like that. Put your needle down through the white material and the leather. Pull tight. Then you're going to go up again between the first and the second. And back through 2 and 3. So I'm going to do the entire thing this way. So I'm using a size 12 beading needle, a long one. Some people prefer short needles. I do use short needles. Here's the difference, an example of the difference. The short needles I use for tacking down when I'm doing applique. I don't use them for anything else because they're so short. They actually stab my fingers a little bit quicker and easier, and I don't like to get stabbed, so I stick with the long ones. They do bend easy. Eventually they do break, but so do the short ones. So once you get to the end of your row, you'll just want to, you'll use however many beads you need to. I'm going to see if I can get 3 on here to finish this. See if that'll fit. Yeah, that should be about perfect. Alright, so I've got that small space right there. I'm going to go down like I have been. Okay, put them in place. Go back up through those 2. Oops. Okay. So this is important, an important next step. What I'm going to do is run my needle and thread back through all of the beads, and I'm going to pull it tight too. And this will straighten anything out that is a little bit crooked. It'll make them sit a little bit straighter. These metal beads have a little bit of a lip on them, so it can be hard to get the needle back in the hole. Oops. Okay, so I have finished the edge of my beadwork and I've gone back through all of the beads. So now what I'm going to do is tie it off. I'm going to go through the top right here and all the way through the back. Make sure you catch the leather. And I'm just going to pick up a pinch of that leather like that. And I'm going to put my needle through this loop twice and pull. And I will do that one more time for good measure. Okay, cut my thread off. And I always burn the thread and melt it just to make sure it sticks. So if you do this, be careful. And it's done.